I didn't feel like I was failing at life. That's what confused me. Nothing was falling apart. Nothing was spiraling. Nothing demanded immediate rescue. And yet, every morning, I woke up with a subtle resistance I couldn't explain, like my body was bracing itself for a day it didn't believe in. I was living a life that worked. That's the problem. It functioned. It made sense. It looked coherent from the outside. But somewhere inside me, a quiet voice kept asking a question I refused to answer: who is this actually for? At first, I thought this discomfort meant I was ungrateful. That I lacked perspective. That I expected too much from life. So I corrected myself. I reminded myself of responsibilities. Of expectations. Of how lucky I was compared to others. That logic kept me stable. It also kept me silent. I learned early how to adapt. How to read a room and become what it needed. How to choose paths that earned approval instead of confusion. Those skills helped me survive. They also slowly erased my sense of direction. I didn't choose this life all at once. I agreed to it in pieces. One reasonable decision after another. One compromise that felt temporary. One "this makes sense" that replaced "this feels right." Each choice was small. Defensible. Easy to explain. Together, they built something heavy. I became very good at performing competence. At sounding certain. At reassuring others that everything was under control. Inside, I felt like I was living in borrowed clothes, nothing obviously wrong, but nothing that fit. I stopped asking myself what I wanted because the answer felt inconvenient. Desire threatened the structure I had built. So I disciplined it. I told myself wanting was childish. That stability mattered more than alignment. That life wasn't supposed to feel personal all the time. Over time, I started believing that. The cost was subtle. I stopped reacting strongly to anything. Good news landed softly. Bad news barely registered. My emotional range narrowed into something manageable, and deeply unsatisfying. I didn't feel depressed. I felt miscast. Like I was playing a role I had memorized perfectly, but never auditioned for. People trusted me. They relied on me. They described me as solid. No one asked if I was fulfilled. And I didn't offer the information. Because I wasn't sure what fulfillment would even look like anymore. I remember a moment, ordinary, forgettable by any external standard, that stayed with me. I was sitting alone after a long day, surrounded by things I had worked hard to obtain. The kind of things that are supposed to signal arrival. And I felt nothing. No pride. No satisfaction. Just distance. That moment frightened me. Not because I was unhappy, but because I couldn't locate myself inside my own life. I started noticing how often I described my days instead of feeling them. How frequently I talked about obligations and outcomes, but never meaning. My life had become a project I was managing. Not an experience I was living. I asked myself, quietly, something I hadn't allowed before: if no one were watching, would I still be here? That question didn't have an answer. It had weight. I realized that much of my identity was built around being acceptable. Being understandable. Being justified. I rarely asked whether it was honest. There was a version of me buried under all that logic, a version that once felt pulled toward things without being able to explain why. I had taught that version to be quiet. Not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. The longer I lived this way, the more normal it felt. That scared me more than discomfort ever could. Because normal can numb you into permanence. I began to sense that the issue wasn't motivation, or discipline, or gratitude. It was orientation. I wasn't lost. I was pointed in the wrong direction, and moving efficiently. That realization didn't inspire me. It unsettled me. Because changing direction meant questioning everything I had invested in. Everything people recognized me for. Everything that made my life make sense. I didn't yet know what to do with that truth. But I knew this much: a life can be successful, stable, and respected, and still not be meant for you. And once that thought takes root, it doesn't let you live quietly anymore. Once I accepted that this life might not be meant for me, everything felt louder. Not the world, me. The smallest decisions suddenly carried weight. Every routine felt rehearsed. Every "it's fine" sounded hollow the moment it left my mouth. I tried to fix the feeling the way I fixed everything else. By optimizing. I adjusted schedules. Added goals. Changed habits. I told myself that if I improved the system, the discomfort would disappear. It didn't. Because the problem wasn't how the life functioned. It was why I was in it. I began noticing how much of my energy went into maintaining coherence, not growth, not joy, coherence. Keeping things consistent. Predictable. Acceptable. I had become the caretaker of a life that didn't nourish me. That realization brought guilt. Who complains about stability? Who questions success that doesn't hurt anyone? I felt illegitimate for wanting something different. So I minimized my dissatisfaction again. I told myself I was just tired. Just restless. Just going through a phase. But the phase didn't pass. It deepened. I started feeling a strange resistance in my body when I imagined the future. Not fear, heaviness. The future looked like a longer corridor of the same rooms. Functional. Orderly. Empty. I noticed how often I fantasized about being someone else, not famous, not powerful, just elsewhere. Somewhere my choices felt intuitive instead of strategic. Somewhere I didn't have to justify why I was there. That fantasy scared me. Because it meant my current life felt like justification, not belonging. I realized how much of my identity depended on continuity. People expected me to remain consistent. Reliable. Understandable. Breaking that continuity would disrupt more than routines. It would disrupt how others understood me. And how I understood myself. That's when the moral dilemma fully surfaced. To stay meant safety, and quiet erosion. To leave meant risk, and visible loss. Leaving would mean admitting that years of effort had led me somewhere misaligned. It would mean accepting that I had invested in the wrong direction, not out of ignorance, but out of compliance. That thought was unbearable. So I delayed. Delay felt responsible. Delay gave me time to think. In reality, delay was just another form of agreement. I kept living the same days, hoping clarity would arrive. Instead, something else arrived. Numbness. Not dramatic. Not depressive. A calm indifference that made everything equally tolerable. That's when I knew something was wrong. Pain still asks for resolution. Numbness accepts stagnation. I stopped feeling urgency about anything, including my own life. That scared me more than anxiety ever had. I began to sense that if I stayed much longer, this life wouldn't feel wrong anymore. It would feel normal. And that normalization would be permanent. I imagined myself years later, still competent, still stable, still detached. No collapse. No tragedy. Just a quiet, well-managed absence. That image terrified me. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was likely. I realized something cruel then. This life wouldn't break me. It would contain me. And containment can be more destructive than chaos. I stopped asking whether leaving made sense. I started asking whether staying was honest. The answer was no. I had been loyal to expectations. To structures. To an image of myself that no longer reflected who I was becoming. But I hadn't been loyal to myself. That loyalty gap was widening every day. I felt caught between two losses. The loss of what I had built. And the loss of who I might still become. One was visible. The other was internal. Only one was reversible. That realization didn't make me brave. It made me cornered. I didn't yet know what I would choose. But I knew something had shifted. This life was no longer neutral. Continuing it was a decision, and a costly one. The question was no longer whether this life was meant for me. The question was, how much longer am I willing to live a life that doesn't ask for my presence? Leaving didn't feel like escape. It felt like confession. Not to others, to myself. For years, I had lived inside a structure that worked so well it almost convinced me I belonged there. Almost. Walking away from it meant admitting something I had avoided for a long time. I had mistaken endurance for alignment. The first step wasn't dramatic. There was no announcement. No symbolic gesture. I simply stopped pretending that effort alone was proof of meaning. I let myself disappoint people. Not deliberately, but inevitably. When you stop living a life that makes sense to others, confusion follows. Concern. Sometimes resentment. I felt the urge to explain myself constantly. To justify the shift. To make it understandable. But the truth didn't translate well. How do you explain that something is wrong when nothing is broken? So I stopped explaining. That was harder than leaving. Without explanations, I had to sit with doubt. My own and everyone else's. There were days when fear convinced me I had made a mistake. That I had abandoned something valuable for an abstract feeling. That I would regret this choice once the novelty wore off. Those thoughts were loud. But beneath them was something steadier. Relief. Not happiness. Relief. The relief of no longer forcing myself into a shape that didn't fit. The relief of waking up without immediately bracing myself for the day. Starting over didn't feel like freedom. It felt like standing in open space with no map. No structure to hide inside. No role to perform automatically. Just presence. That presence was uncomfortable. Without the old life, I had to confront who I was without context. Without achievements to point to. Without routines to lean on. I discovered how much of my identity had been constructed around approval. How often I chose coherence over curiosity. Safety over truth. Letting go of that identity felt like shedding a skin that had protected me, and suffocated me at the same time. There were moments I wanted to go back. To rebuild the old life slightly differently. To optimize instead of transform. Comfort whispered that I could return anytime. But I knew better. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I had seen the cost of staying. And once you see that cost clearly, going back feels dishonest. Slowly, something unexpected happened. I started feeling time again. Days stopped blending together. Moments left impressions. Not because life became exciting, but because I was finally inside it. I began making choices that felt small but intentional. Not impressive. Not strategic. Just honest. I learned that meaning doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly when your actions and inner life stop arguing with each other. I still carry regret. For the years I spent efficient but absent. For the version of myself that waited too long to speak. But regret no longer feels like condemnation. It feels like information. A reminder of what happens when you live without presence. If you're listening to this and something in you feels restless without knowing why, hear this carefully. You don't need proof that your life is wrong to change it. You don't need disaster to justify redirection. You don't need permission to question a path that looks successful. A life can function perfectly, and still not be yours. Staying in it won't destroy you. It will just require you to disappear slowly. I didn't leave because I was brave. I left because I finally understood the risk of staying. And the moment I chose presence over coherence, truth over comfort, alignment over explanation, my life didn't become easier. But it became inhabited. And being fully present in an imperfect life is infinitely better than living flawlessly somewhere you don't belong. That's the choice I finally made. And it's the one thing I no longer regret.